Hey, welcome. This is our first inaugural diffusion modeling reading group. I'm pleased to introduce Nick Randolph, who's going to do some of the leadership on this and also kick us off with the initial meeting. So I'll turn it over to Nick to introduce himself and also get us going.
Hi, thank you, everybody. My name's Nick Randolph, and I'm a graduate student in Brian Coleman's lab at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm doing deep learning for protein design. And this is kind of how I started to dive into diffusion-based generative models. So I'd love to give you an introduction for this reading group, as well as kind of give you an overview of what we plan to be doing in this group. Let's see. Okay. All right, so the outline for today, we're going to give a brief introduction to the meeting group itself, a little bit of logistics, what we plan to do for the schedule, as well as future topics. Then I'm going to go over an overview of what diffusion-based generative models are, and I'm going to abbreviate this DGM.
Nick, your audio is cut out. We can't hear you. Nick, can you hear us? Oh, hang on a sec. I can see that you're muted, Nick. Try again.
Okay, can you hear me? Sorry,
yes. Oh, good.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know where that cut out, so
DGMs.
Okay, perfect. DGMs, yeah, so we're going to talk about what diffusion is and how it works. And then I'm going to go into some details. I'm not going to list all this, but we'll go into this and kind of get an understanding of what diffusion is, as well as the components that make it up. Then we're going to go and just do a high-level summary, get some key points and takeaways, and then I'm going to point you to some recommended readings for if you're curious into some more of the theoretical foundation. So first of all, the logistics. The plan is to meet every 2 weeks. So next meeting would be planned for 2 weeks from today. So that's Wednesday, September 27th. Planning to do it just the same time, 11 a.m. EDT. The topic, tentatively, we're planning on just doing some practical considerations and some more math into the foundations of diffusion, but that's still up for debate. And I'd love to hear some input from you guys who are actually going to be listening to people talk, and I want everybody to kind of get something out of this group. So the first kind of paper that would be, I don't know if we're going to dive into this paper exactly, but we'll take some of the practical considerations that come from this paper, and then we're also going to dive into some more of the math. At least that's what we're tentatively talking about. We can discuss this in more detail. The future meetings will also, in general, besides this first one and the next one, in general, we'll discuss specific papers, and we're going to dive into the methods, discuss the results and the implications, and try to get a better understanding of methods and how to do this yourself if you're interested. And if possible, we're going to try to include the authors, because that's always fun. And I really want this to be interactive, so we're going to have polls to vote on and select the papers for discussion, and we'll kind of see that some potential protein-related diffusion papers that we could talk about. There's this RF diffusion paper. I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with that. It's a great paper, and it could be really fun to talk to. Maybe we can get some of the authors to come with us. There's this frame diff paper, SE3 diffusion, protein-protein docking with diffusion. There's another generative model for backbones. This is Genie. Eigenfold that does structure prediction with diffusion, as well as DiffPack that does sidechain packing with diffusion. So there's lots going on. This is just a small select of all the things going on in diffusion, as well as in diffusion with proteins and macromolecules. So lots of going on. These are just a handful, but we can discuss exactly what that is going to be at the end. So why are we even talking about diffusion models and diffusion-based generative models?
Before you dive into it, is there any questions or people have any thoughts on the structure or basic logistics? I think this time works pretty well for most people, but I know if you are not here, then maybe you can speak up and then let us know that this isn't working for you. So But just kidding. We'll also do like a when is good or doodle poll to see if there's a time that may work for other people better. But this hopefully will be a good time we're getting a pretty good turnout today.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that reminds me, I would love for this to actually be a discussion rather than me just talking to my screen. So if you have any questions or concerns or anything, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and jump right in. I'd love to take any questions. All right. So why are we even interested in diffusion models? Well, I'm sure most of you have seen headlines recently of image generation, and a lot of them recently have been using diffusion models. So say DALL-E 2, um, give it in a prompt, an astronaut riding a horse in a photorealistic style. It can give us an amazing image. So here we have exactly what we asked for. We have an astronaut on a horse, great detail on the moon, maybe, or who knows where that's at, but yeah, amazing detail. This is a diffusion model. Another example, stable diffusion. Here we give them the prompt of a propaganda poster depicting a cat dressed as French Emperor Napoleon holding a piece of cheese. So you can get really crazy with some of these prompts. You can go very descriptive, and it's very good at actually creating this. So we get exactly what we asked for. The cheese is a little wonky, but like for the most part, it's a great image. We can also do other things with Midjourney. Here we asked for a vibrant picture of California poppies, and that's exactly what we got. It's very stylized as well. So these generative art methods are really powerful, and they can give us amazing quality images as well as a variety of images. So diversity as well as quality. All right. We can also do other things with these diffusion models rather than just generating whole images. We can also just generate portions of images or modify them. So this is an application of stable diffusion where certain portions of this image were masked out and we were told to rebuild some of it. So you can see the pose is pretty much identical across these different images, but the content itself is actually differing as well. So there's a lot of like variability we can do with these diffusion models. We can also generate some pretty cool videos if you go from the starting point to your complete data. So I'll let this play a little bit, but in this case, you're seeing the noise being transformed into data using the diffusion model. And that's what they all do, and we'll dive into that a little bit, but we can create some pretty cool pictures, as well as image or videos, as well as images. There's also diffusion models for proteins. I'm sure all of you are familiar with RF diffusion. Here's just a little GIF of a protein diffusing, a protein binder diffusing onto a target protein. There are also other methods. Genie, for example, is a rather recent one that does diffusion over more frames. And so it's working really well for proteins as well. And that's kind of where we're kind of going to take up the perspective for diffusion models. We're going to kind of look at them from a biological or protein-based perspective. Cool. Any questions about that? All right. So let's actually dive in. What is diffusion and how does it work? Well, the main idea is really to take data, corrupt it with noise, and then learn to undo that corruption process or to denoise these images. So let's take an example. Here we have this wonderful landscape of a mountain. Say we want to train a model to generate more of these amazing pictures. Well, to do this in the diffusion framework, the first thing we do is add some noise to it. So we essentially, yeah, just add Gaussian noise. This makes the image blurrier, makes it harder to detect the actual signal, what the image is of. And we can keep doing this all the way to the point where we have no data. We've destroyed the data content in this image. We have complete random static noise like you would see on a TV. Well, this is the process we'd like to learn to undo. So we'd like to go in the reverse direction. Oh, sorry. In the end, we have that random distribution. This is going to be our prior. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but this entire process constitutes the forward diffusion process. But like I said, this is what we'd like to be able to undo. So we'd like to be able to reverse and denoise our images. So we start with our completely random prior. and we remove some noise from it. We get some image that has a little bit more clarity in it. We can start to see some mountains forming, but we keep going, and hopefully we can go back to the original data by removing all the noise. And this process is the reverse diffusion process. And this reverse diffusion process is actually what's being learned. So the forward process is completely defined beforehand, and there's no learning involved, but the reverse diffusion process is what's being learned. All right, so like I mentioned, the diffusion process iteratively corrupts our data towards a simple prior distribution. So in this case, we had our image of this landscape, of this mountain. We add some noise, corrupt it a little bit, so it's a little bit less clear what's going on. We do it again, and now we're back at our random prior. So if we just randomly sample from a very simple distribution, in this case a Gaussian distribution, we can generate something like this and infinite number of these. This forward process actually forms what's called in mathematics a Markov chain. We're not going to really go into a lot of the details in this this meeting. I think next meeting we're going to kind of try to dive into more of the practical considerations as well as the math. But I'm still going to give you like a little bit of math here. So this forms a chain of t steps. So we need a certain amount of steps to order to go from the data itself all the way to this noise. So let's say our data is time step 0. If we noise maybe half of the way, we get this second image. So we're kind of in between the completely noised and the completely data time point. And then we go all the way to the time step t, we have complete noise. So no information left in this model. Let's also use some variables to describe these images. So I'm going to use this notation. It's a little unclear exactly what this is, so let's talk about that. So x0 is, so x is going to represent an image, and then the subscript is going to represent the time step. So we have the first image at time step 0, and it's going to be coming from some sort of distribution. This is our data distribution, which really just means this is our set of pictures that have landscapes of mountains. So these are just everything that we'd like our model to be able to capture. So if we want to be able to reproduce a bunch of natural scenes like this that have mountains in the background, then our data distribution is a bunch of pictures of mountains. If we want to do landscapes, we would also incorporate some other things, probably more than just mountains, maybe an ocean, because that's a pretty important landscape. Cool. So going forward, we can kind of generalize this to say we have any arbitrary image along this noising trajectory at a time step t is just going to be drawn from a distribution at the certain time step. And I'm not going to really define what this looks like or anything like that. It's just some sort of distribution of noisy images that aren't completely noised and still have a little bit of content in them, but it's not like super clear. And in the end, at time step capital T, we have another image, and this is just drawn from the prior distribution. And I'm going to represent this prior distribution as just pi, but this should be ideally really easy to sample from. So in this case, we're using Gaussian prior, so we can just easily sample from the Gaussian distribution. If you want to do a uniform prior, you can do that. The goal is really just to make this prior super simple to actually sample from. Let's define some shapes for these variables, because I find it a little bit more intuitive if you can visualize or kind of get a grasp of what the shapes and what are happening to these actual images. So this image has a certain height to it, so a certain height and a certain width. So this is going to be a matrix of height and width pixels. And notice that all of these x's are all the same shape, because we have images at these time steps. So the size of the images aren't actually changing, so we're going to keep the same shape. But the content is what's changing between these. So like I mentioned, the forward process injects Gaussian noise. I'm not going to really go into what Gaussian noise is, because I'm going to kind of assume that you have that. But this is a recursive formula to generate an image at time step t from an image at time step t-1. And it's a little unclear exactly what this means, but let's walk it through. So time step t is what we're interested in. If we have a previous time step, we can move it away from that. So we're going to move a little bit more towards the mean of 0, away from the actual content of the previous image. So in this case, we're moving away from a pure clean image to something that's a little noisier, and we have to add the noise to it. So we add some noise that has a certain variance, so a certain level of noise to it. If we look at like the first step, so this is a recursive formula, so we can actually look at individual time steps. To go from the completely data distribution, so x0, we can add some initial noise to it, and then we get x1. So we now have some noisy step, that noisy image that's kind of in here. We can keep going, and we get x2 from x1. So we have x1, we add a little bit more noise to it. Once again, we're not changing the actual shape. This is still an image, but we're just changing the content of that image. So this is a nice recursive formula. We can go from time step 0 to 1 to 2, etc., all the way down, all the way up to time step t. But this process isn't super clear, because what if we want to just go to an arbitrary time step? That's not really super clear. We have to generate all of the previous ones. So if we wanted time step 5, we would have to generate 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. That's extensive, and not really what you want to be doing in practice. But fortunately, this form is really nice, and we can actually define some new variables to make this a simpler form. So I'm going to define.
Hey, Nick, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you add the noise, in this case, let's say you're dealing with pictures, are you just changing some parameters for each individual pixel? Like, is there any correlation in the noise that's added to pixel in a neighboring pixel, or is like each pixel sort of treated independently?
So the noise we're adding is isotropic. So we have this identity matrix here from this normal distribution. So there is no correlation between pixels, at least in this simple example. Like there totally could be, but in this example, we're just going to kind of ignore that and assume that there's no covariance across the pixels, the noise we're adding for the pixels.
Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So we can start forming this trajectory. So we go from 0 to 1 to 1 to 2. But what if we want to just skip from 0 to 2? We can actually define some new variables. So I'm just going to define this alpha of t is going to be 1 minus this beta of t. I still really haven't described what beta of t is, but I'm going to ask that you hold on to that thought. We'll talk about that very shortly. But this controls the noise. So imagine this is the noise parameter. As beta increases, if it's closer and closer to 1, if it gets bigger, then there's a lot more noise in the image. So here we have a completely noisy image. So beta is really high in this image. If beta is 0, then we have no noise, and it would correspond to this first image here. So we can also define alpha star or alpha bar as the cumulative product of all these alphas. And if you haven't seen this pi notation here, it's really just it's like a sum, but you're doing products instead of summations. Anyway, so the cool thing is we can directly form an equation that goes directly from time step 0 all the way to time step t, no matter what that time step t is. And that really just takes advantage of these parameters here, or these new variables here. And it's not super clear why this happens. There's some math behind it, and we can talk about that in the next meeting if people are curious. But it involves a reparameterization trick and just taking this recursive formula in the previous slide and just building it up. So yeah, a little summary here. Any time step t, we can generate a noisy image from just the clean image and some noise. So we add some noise depending on the time step. That's really governed here in the alphas. We can add that noise to our initial data and get a noisy image at any time step. So that's a really nice property, and that's going to be very useful for us when we train these models. I mentioned this variant schedule B or beta. This, like I mentioned, was the noise, and this controls the level of noise. And so generally, you want to change the level of noise throughout the trajectory. So in some of the earliest works, they included a linear schedule. So this goes from time step 0, this is 0 here, and time step t here. It goes from time step 0 at a really low level of noise, and it gradually linearly increases all the way to time step t. And so you can see that here with these images. So this is time step 0. If we take 5 steps towards the noisy, completely noised image, we can linearly add noise to it. So this is one of the first beta schedules that was used for diffusion models, but you can easily come up with new ones. So there's this beta, or there's a quadratic schedule you could use. So in this case, the beta changes quadratically with time. And so you can see there's a little less noise here, but eventually it catches up. So it starts slower, but then catches up. Cosine schedule has been really useful and has been very promising in a lot of methods. And it's really just a little different, but it kind of follows the same idea of adding a little bit of noise, but for a long time. And then at the very end, we inject a lot of noise. So noise is gradually building up, and then suddenly there's a lot. So we can kind of see that in the images here. So this is what beta is, and this is a very important hyperparameter, but we'll talk about that also a little bit later. But in general, this describes the full forward process. So let's kind of summarize the forward process before we move on. But like I mentioned, we start with a data. So this is a clean image of what we want to be generating, or the distribution we want to be learning. We add some noise to it, a certain amount of noise for a certain amount of time steps. So we get a noisy image. We keep going all the way to a simple prior distribution or a random prior distribution. So this is the forward diffusion process. And like I mentioned, there's no learnable parameters here. This is just a completely defined process before. And we want to learn to undo this process in the reverse trajectory. So before I go into the reverse, how do we actually denoise this? I'd like to stop and ask if there are any questions about the forward process.
Hi, Nick. Maybe one question that comes into mind. I'm not sure if I grabbed understanding of why specifically there are different ways of introducing noise.
Yeah. So you're asking about why there are different ways to inject noise. And is that right? Sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So this is really just something that the early practitioners of diffusion models, if you can call them early, this is like 2 years ago, but they came up with, they originally tried a bunch of different things. So they tried with a beta schedule that was constant. So they weren't changing the level of noise throughout the model. And they found that it didn't really produce satisfying samples. So the images that were generated at the end were not very good quality or not very good diversity. So the beta schedule was introduced. So they started with this linear one. So the idea was maybe if we can gradually remove less and less noise as we go in the reverse trajectory, then maybe the model is able to learn a little easier. Maybe it's a little easier to, or we need to spend more time generating the true data information from the noisy image. So spend more time with less noise, essentially. And they found that really helped improve the sample quality as well as diversity and other things, fidelity. And so people just kept trying different schedules. So quadratic did pretty good. And then cosine does even better. And the kind of intuition behind that is the noise, there's really not a lot here to make from a good sample from. Like, I have no idea how to turn this into a mountain. But once we move it a little bit, take a couple steps, this is a lot more clear. I can spend a lot more time refining this into a nice mountain. I can take a small time step and the image is even clearer. And if we keep going through this process, the images get clearer and clearer. There's a lot less noise. And by doing so, we can generate a lot finer detail into here. So I can start to see a little smaller mounds or hills inside of this image. So I think that's kind of the intuition I have for these schedules. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Any
Hi,
other
Nick.
questions?
I'm Le. I have another question. It sounds like you have a lot of time point. How to define the how many time points you need to train the diffusion model? This is the first question. My second question is that it sounds like a diffusion model need to denoise noisy figure step by step. I guess it's a little slower than VAE model or GAN model. Is that correct?
Yes, those are both very good points. And so we can kind of see that the answer to the first question here. So your first question was about how many time steps do we really need for these diffusion models? So we can see that here that at least in this example, they use 1,000 time steps. And that's pretty common, use hundreds or thousands of time steps. At least in these earlier versions, there had been some recent work to try to speed up the sampling process, but most of the early diffusion processes use hundreds or thousands of time steps. And so this gets into your second point. It is very slow. That's exactly right. These are very slow compared to GANs or VAEs, which both consist of other generative models. So the GANs and VAEs also generate new samples from a data distribution by manipulating, well, they do it in different ways, but you can generate new samples from a distribution using these two methods, but they do it in a one-step fashion. So you just take one step and now you have a new data set or a new sample from your data. In this case, it is very slow. You have to take time step t to t-1 all the way down to 0. So it is a slow process, but there are some techniques to use to actually speed it up. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but also probably more in the second session.
Thank you. That's great.
Anything else?
Hi Nick, I have a simple question. This cosine, why doesn't it look like a normal cosine? Is it a hyperbolic cosine?
So it doesn't look like cosine in this image, but if you like change what the axes are, then it does have a cosine shape, and it's kind of really just if you start at the top of the mode of the kind of cosine shape, it takes the kind of like downward slope portion, so it goes from the 1 to the 0 idea, but yeah, it's not really clear. But trust me, there's a cosine somewhere in there. It's hidden in this image. Yeah, you'll just have to take my word for that.
Hey Nick.
Hey.
Can I ask one question? Basically, I'm wondering if basically diffusion model remembers all the exact values of all the noise in each step. If so,
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
You can keep going. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. If so, maybe for like reverse process, is it possible to just adding all the noises and back to them? Just subtract this noisy image to like fast image or something.
Yeah. So you're asking if you think the model can learn exactly what noise was added at each time step and just be able to memorize that and reproduce that or undo that. Is that what you're asking?
Yes. So yes, that's exactly what I'm asking.
Okay. Yeah. So the short answer, I don't think so. And that answer comes from a couple different places. One, the noise that we're adding is still random, so it's different every time. So the model is going to have a really hard time remembering what the true noise we added was because it's changing constantly. The second point is there's a lot of time steps, and so that's a lot to memorize. If we go from time step 0 all the way to 1,000, that's a lot of different noises you're adding at a lot of different pixels. there's a lot going on there. And usually I don't think the models are big enough to really remember all of that, because honestly, there are an infinite number of ways you can sample the noise at each time step. So short answer, no. Long answer, I don't think I don't think it's possible.
I see. Thank you. I just thought like if models remember all the noises, maybe it's very easy to back to the previous steps. So maybe that might shorten the noising time or something. But maybe it takes so much process.
And another factor that contributes to that, to make it a harder problem, is we're not using the same image every time. There's going to be a bunch of different images that look slightly different, that have different components in it. So it also has to learn how to undo the noise that was added to different components of images, because they're not all going to contain the same mountain peaks here.
I see. Thanks.
Any other questions on the forward process? All right, let's dive into the reverse process. And this is, like I mentioned, I think the more interesting portion, because this is where the actual learning comes in. So like I mentioned before, the reverse process takes this noise from a random prior and denoises it. So we need to remove some of the noise and generate content. So we remove some noise, we start to generate some mountains in the background. We can start to see them. It's still blurry, but it's starting to be there. We remove some more noise, and eventually we have a clean image. This is the process we want to learn. And overall, it's called the reverse diffusion process. I put these asterisks here to make sure to reinforce that these are the learned. This is where the learning comes in. This is where our model takes over. So what does that actually mean? So the reverse diffusion process denoises corrupted data to generate new samples from the data distribution. So that's very wordy. Let's actually talk about what that means. So like I mentioned, we start with a sample from the random prior. So in this case, we just randomly take noise, static from our Gaussian prior, and we want to denoise it. So we remove some noise, add some content, we keep going, and we eventually have this. So let's start to use some math to more formally define this. So we start with time step capital T. This is our completely noised image. We have x of t, which is this noised image from our prior distribution. Once again, the shape is still just a height and a width. It's still the same image. We take a couple steps backwards, and now we're at time step t, or 1/2 of t. And we have now a sample that's noisy with still a little bit of content in it. So this is x of little t, and still the same shape, because we're not actually changing the shape of these images. We go a couple steps further back, and eventually we get to time step 0, which means we should have a sample that looks like something from our distribution. So it now looks exactly like something that came from the distribution. So a bunch of mountains, or maybe a landscape, something like that. So the forward diffusion process used this formula to go from time step 0 all the way to time step little t. And this does it by injecting Gaussian noise through this epsilon here. Essentially, what we're doing is sampling a variable xt, so a corrupted image from a distribution. So this is a sample, a corrupted image from a distribution, and this distribution is really controlled, is conditional on the data, the true data image. So what that's essentially saying is we take this true data and we add noise to it, and then we get one of those possible. So we can add noise in an infinite number of ways. The Gaussian noise, we can generate tons of different ways to do that. We just take one of those. So we're generating a sample, a noised sample from our initial clean sample with a certain level of noise to it. That's all this is saying here. So once we generate that sample, ideally in the reverse process, we like to reverse it. So this is really just switching some things around. So now, given a noisy sample, so say we start here, can we predict what the clean, the final true sample looks like? And so we're going to try to get a new sample from this distribution. I'm calling this distribution P, and I'm giving it a subscript of theta. This theta is really to just denote that this is containing parameters that are learned. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but the idea is, given some sort of noisy sample, can we generate a new sample from that? So something that looks like our mountains here or our natural landscape or whatever. And the secret to doing this is really hidden in this equation over here in this epsilon. So there are two main approaches that people use for doing this. The first one is to use a neural network, which I'm going to be denoting as f of theta. So the parameters are still in theta. A neural network that takes in the noisy image. So this is our noisy image of height and width, and our time step. So we need the time step as well. So we're conditioning our model on the time step. And we take our model and we ask it to predict how much noise it thinks was added to this image. So we have our noisy image here. We're trying to predict how much noise was added to it from the true clean image. So this is one way to do it. And then we'll train on this predicted value here. The second way to do it is to predict the x0 directly. So instead of predicting this epsilon here, we can try predicting x0 directly. So given the noisy image and the time step, ask our neural network here, F, to predict what it thinks the clean image looks like. So here we're just asking, we're giving it this middle image here and asking it, what would the true image look like? And maybe it gives us something like this, maybe a little less clean. But that's what this second approach is doing. And when we do this, we can still compute how much noise was added just using this equation here. So we can approximate it. If we just move this term over here and then do a little division, we can actually compute how much noise the model thinks was added. So this is cool and all. We can ask our model to predict some things. We ask it to predict or how much noise it thinks was added, or what we think the original sample was. But how do we actually train? How do we actually do the learning process? How do we manipulate these parameters to help fit this goal of generating a new sample from the distribution? Well, the way that it's trained is using this elbow loss. And I'm not going to go into the details. There are three main terms here, but we can talk about how these terms are derived and what they actually mean in the next session. This is really just a high-level overview, but I'd like to emphasize that there are three main terms. There's this L0, L capital T, and then this summation of L little t's. The first term here is L0, and that is the reconstruction term. So that's essentially asking how well we are able to reconstruct the true data from one time step away. So we're actually going from time step 1 to time step 0. How good we can actually recapitulate the true data here. The second term is the prior term. What this is essentially asking is, when we completely noise our data, so we go all the way to time step capital T, does that distribution look like the true prior distribution that we're asking for? So in this case, does this distribution coming from noising everything look like a true Gaussian prior distribution? And so we're trying to make sure that it does. So that's what this term is accounting for. Now, this next term is a little more ambiguous, but essentially it's a denoising step term. What I mean by this is we're going from time step T. So we have a noisy image at time step T. We want to denoise it. So we're going to time step T minus 1. This is asking how well we're recapitulating that step from time step T to T minus 1, because we want it to be as ideal as possible. And so that's what this term is trying to capture. I know that was a little ambiguous, but we can dive into the details next session if people are curious. But a lot of the focus for training these models has been focused on this last term, this denoising step term. And some awesome work by these authors down here came up with a more simple loss term. So they simplified this loss term to really just be an MSE loss on the predicted noise. So this is super simple, and it's a very easy loss function to calculate. This is just a mean squared error of the noise. So what we're doing is, at a particular time step, T, we have a noised image x of t. This is still height and width. And we predict how much noise was added. So we either use this formulation here, where we predict how much noise was added, or we use this formulation here and then reconstruct how much noise was here. So either way, we have how much noise the model thinks was added to this image. And then we know how much noise we actually added. We can compute the loss here. So we try to match what the model thinks was added to the image with how much was actually added. And then we just take the expectation over all these variables. And very simply, this is just a mean squared error loss on the predicted noise. And this expectation is calculated through the stochastic gradient descent, the actual training process. Cool. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the reverse step. The next thing we're going to get into is what the actual algorithms for training and sampling these models might look like. But before we do that, I'd like to take another break and ask if there's any questions on this reverse diffusion process.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you always trying to predict x0 from the given time step, or is it like t-1 given t?
So these are two of the common ways to do it. You just mentioned another way you could actually do this. You could, given time step t, you could predict time step t-1. That is a third way to do this. I kept it out because I think it's one of the least common ways to do it. I think these two are a lot more popular. But you could also do that. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So looking at the very noisy picture on the very right-hand side in the previous slide, I can't really understand how can it generate any useful information from that. Like as you said, this is random, kind of a random noise being introduced here. So you can essentially denoise it into many ways. Why exactly will it go into the trajectory of ending up similar to the image that was not noisy from the first place?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And honestly, I don't know. That's kind of just the magic of these diffusion models. So somehow it's learned to take this noisy image, which at the end of this trajectory at time step capital T, we've added a whole bunch of noise to this image. So in this case, these alphas are really large, or at least really small, sorry. So we've added a lot of noise to this image. And so it knows to just move things around a whole lot. So it's going to move things around, and it's still going to be very messy. It's still going to look a lot like this in time step capital T-1. But the problem, the thing is, there's a lot of time to actually make something useful out of this. So it's going to spend some time in this completely noisy region where we don't really know what we're doing or what we're forming. And eventually we'll start to see a little bit of like information coming in, like, ooh, I can start to see some mountains here. Maybe back here are some more mountains, or like maybe like this could be a mountain, maybe, if the trajectory went somewhere else. But in the end, it comes out to be a cloud. So it spends a lot of time here, and a lot of things can change. So we can go from this image to something completely different. It might not be this one exactly here. I'm going to actually jump back to one of these earlier slides that has the video on it, because I think that really highlights this. So you can see here in the denoising process, we spend a lot of time, and you can start to see things coming into view, and they might not turn out the way you expected, because it just figures out that, oh, I might want to do it a different way. So there's a lot of things happening here. We don't know like exactly what it's trying to create here. And honestly, the model doesn't know either. It thinks it has a good idea, but as the trajectory goes, we still add noise to it. And so eventually it can figure out where to go. So that was a very long-winded explanation, but hopefully that
But
helped.
that's very interesting, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions while I skip back ahead?
I have a quick question. I guess I'm wondering if this reverse diffusion process is deterministic for a given input. So like I know you can come up with infinite different noisy inputs to start with, but if you give a model the same, like the exact same noise profile a bunch of times, will it give you the same image out?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So from what I understand, correct me, but I'm going to repeat what I think the question was asking.
So far, we've just been talking about the loss function. Maybe it's worth going through the learning and the inference step, and then maybe we can come back to that, because I think that you're asking about the inference, not the loss itself. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's come back to this after we go through the algorithms. So let's see what those look like. I'm going to actually start with the sampling algorithm. And what I mean by sampling, I just mean inference. So this is when you're actually using this model, this is the algorithm that you're following. So the first step is to take a sample from our prior distribution. So in this case, we get that really noisy image from our prior Gaussian distribution. So we have X at capital T. And then for a certain number of time steps, so we go from all the way capital T all the way back to time step 0 or time step 1, we sample some noise and do this computation here. And I'm going to break this down a little bit. So the first step in this computation is to compute the predicted noise. So here we have this epsilon of theta. So this is reminiscent of the f of theta that I used earlier. So given the noisy image, so this is X at capital T at first, so this is a completely noisy image, and the time step that we're on, we're going to predict how much noise was added. And then once we have this predicted noise, we're going to take a small step in that direction. So we're going to take a small step to remove that noise. And so this gets us an image that is slightly cleaner. And if we do this enough times, if we keep sampling this, going through t minus 1, t minus 2, all the way back down to time 1 or time 0, we eventually have this denoised image here. So once again, we sample from the prior distribution to get some noisy image that has no information in it. And then we slowly take steps to remove that image. So we ask our network to predict what it thinks, how much noise we think was added, and then we take a small step to remove that noise. And then we keep going all the way to the process where we have an actual sample from the data set, or something that looks like from the data set. The actual training process looks honestly pretty different, but we'll walk through that too. So the first step is we need these certain variables here. And so these come into play with this equation that I mentioned earlier. We have X at a noisy image at X time step T that we can compute based on the true clean image and some noise. So the way that we start, we need our true image. So the first thing we do is get an example from our data set. So we have some data set that has a bunch of mountains in it. We get that first mountain image here. So we just take one of those. We also need to select which time we're going to actually be evaluating on. So which time step T here, so we can get a noisy version of this image. So we get our time, and then we get how much noise we're adding to it. So we get this variable here that's going to be affecting how much noise is in the noisy image. And then we take a gradient descent step. So this is a little, we'll break this down too, actually. So what we do here, so everything in these parentheses here, we are effectively noising our image all the way to time step T. So what this is forming here, this computation, is forming X of T. So this is our noised image at some time step T. And we just compute that from our clean sample, the noise that we're adding, and the time step. We ask our model to then predict how much error was added, and then we compute the loss. So we just do the MSE loss on the predicted error using the true error, and we take a gradient descent step on that MSE. And hopefully, if we do this enough times, we'll eventually converge and have our fully trained model. Okay. Hopefully that made sense. I'd like to open up questions about these algorithms.
Hey, Nick, the training algorithm makes sense to me because you randomly start from a different time step each time, right? So sometimes you're randomly starting with just half noise, so there's a partial image there. So it makes sense that you could sort of get back to that image.
Mhm.
That seems like an important feature of the training. But in the sampling algorithm, if you think about it where you always start just from random noise, it seems like you'd have no hope of ever getting back to the starting image.
Yeah. I think once again, this comes back to one of the previous questions we had where I went back to the video. It is kind of magical how it goes from completely random noise to start to form a little bit of content, and eventually it brings that content out and fully like comes and brings a sample from our true data set. It is pretty astonishing, but it's really, yeah. So that's, I guess, why we're talking about this. It's so cool.
Brian, one of the intuitions that I have here is it's related to like annealing process in a statistical mechanics sense. So adding Gaussian noise you can think of as like a little parabolic potential. And so if you raise the temperature, you're kind of bringing it up to a noise distribution. And the denoising is kind of like lowering the temperature to bring it back down. So we're kind of sampling up where there's no energy surface. We're just bouncing all around. And as you denoise it, we're just annealing it down into a well. And we've kind of trained these wells to be really nice and smooth because we have these sort of smooth harmonic potentials around each data point. So we kind of
Yeah,
fall
and
into a well and then you kind of drift down to the bottom.
But if the training algorithm always started from like big T, like the maximum time step, it wouldn't work, would it?
The training algorithm?
Yeah.
So you're asking, can you go from a completely noised image to a
Like if
sampled
that's
image?
all the training you do, like isn't it
Yeah.
important that this training algorithm that you're randomly sampling from different time steps?
It is pretty important. That one-step process that you're kind of mentioning is very reminiscent of a VAE, so the variational autoencoder. So what that architecture is doing is taking your data and moving it into some latent space, which is essentially our prior distribution. And then it learns to take that prior distribution and reconstruct the data. So this is a very one-step fashion. And you can kind of think of diffusions as a slower version of that. Like we take a lot more time steps to get there. And so VAEs do work. You are able to generate samples from them, but there are some problems with VAEs. And I think the most notable one is the quality of the images or the samples that you get from them just aren't very good. And I think this comes back to your question where I think that comes from the fact that you're not able to really get these fine details from something that is completely noisy. But if you have a lot of time steps to really refine and remove the noise from your images, you can get a really nice high quality sample from that. And that's what really the power of the diffusion comes from. We're able to refine our prediction multiple times, gradually removing noise from it and get something that's really nice and high quality.
Nick, I have a question. In there's sort of three components here. There's the loss function, the training, and the sampling. What's the computational complexity of these, especially as a function of T? Can you do the loss function kind of in one step? Can you do the training at one step and then the inference is the slow step that you actually go through each T?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So because in this training process, we're just randomly sampling a time step, this is a really easy, quick calculation. We're really just taking a time step, computing that noisy image, and then asking our model how much noise we added to that image. So this is just a one step on a very like infinitesimal time step level, very small time step. So this is super quick. The training process, I mean, that computation itself is quick. Like the training process will take a while because there's a lot of different time steps and it's a hard process to learn all that. But that one computation is relatively quick. Versus the full sampling process where we have to do this calculation. So this is essentially performing one forward pass through the network and computing a loss and derivatives on that. This is for every time step we're doing, we're also computing one forward pass through the network. And so every time step, we have to do a forward pass of the network. So that gets really slow, especially if we have hundreds or thousands of time steps. So yeah, I agree that the sampling inference algorithm is a lot slower than the training.
More questions?
Hi, Nick. I'm still a little confused about the gradient descent step formula. In this formula, you do the loss. You do the gradient descent. You do the gradient descent to the loss, and the first term is epsilon. Is the arrow term. The arrow is the true arrow, right? And the second term, I'm a little confused about what that second term mean. It's just like the arrow. This is the arrow function with theta. The theta should be the trained parameter from the neural network, and it has two parameters. The first one, I think the first one is xt, and the second one is the time step. It sounds like the first one related we always put the xt related to x0, not the xt minus 1, right? So yeah, I'm a little confused about the this terminology in the gradient descent formula.
Yeah. So you're exactly right with the breakdown of this term here. So I'm just going to reiterate what you said. This first one is the true noise that we added to that image. And this epsilon of theta here is our neural network. So I used a little bit of different notation on the previous slide, where I use this f of theta. This is the same thing. So in the notation on the next slide, f of theta is really just this first formulation where we're asking our neural network to predict the noise that was added. So we're kind of using this first formulation here. And you're right, the next step here is taking our noised image, x of t. So notice that this equation here is the exact same thing as up here. So we're just taking x of t and our time step and asking our model what it thinks, how much noise was added to that. And then we just compare that with the true noise, and that's where we get our gradients from, our loss from, and then we can compute gradients on that loss. Does that help?
Yes, so I found that xt always related to x0, the initial time point, not the previous time point, not the previous time point, like t minus 1, right?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that is a difference between the kind of training and the sampling. So in the sampling, we are going from each time step to the previous time step. So we're going from time step capital T to time step t minus 1 to time step t minus 2. We are actually walking down that time trajectory. But in the training, we can actually do it a little bit more efficiently because we can randomly sample the time step and actually generate an image at whatever time step we want, any arbitrary time step. We can compute these gradients very efficiently and do stochastic gradient descent and really train our model very efficiently here. So this is really taking advantage of the whole training machinery that's built around these deep neural networks. But if you can't actually do this one-stop sampling here, then you'd have to approach it some different way. And honestly, the reason we're able to do this formulation here to generate our noised image at any arbitrary time step is because we were using Gaussian noise. And we'll talk about this more, I think, in the next meeting. But the noise we're being added affects the distribution of the true data, as well as the true distribution of the data affects how we add the noise. So there's a little bit of special crafting we have to go into there, but this is all because we have the special Gaussian noise. Yeah, I don't know if that helped.
Yeah,
Maybe
thank you.
time,
Thank you so
maybe
much.
maybe I think this is your maybe last slide or second to last slide. let's finish up, and then if we want, people can stick around and then ask more questions, we can do that after.
Yeah, that sounds great. So this next slide was just a bunch of extensions. We'll talk about these more in detail next meeting. We'll dive into some of these and actually like talk about what they mean. But there are a bunch of cool extensions. We're going to share this PowerPoint, so I'm not going to go through these right now. But feel free to go through them whenever you want. But I would like to talk about the summary of at least what we've talked about today. So in the forward process, noise is iteratively added to our data. So we iteratively corrupt our images, get some noisy image. And so we can get some noisy image at time step t from our initial one by sampling and using that one equation that I kept coming back to. The reverse process is what's being learned. That's what the model is trying to do, to remove noise from that image and generate something from the same data distribution. So we have our noisy image, we try to correct it and get our true denoised image. The variance schedule, beta of t, is really important, and it's a critical hyperparameter because this really controls how much noise is being added. And DGMs are usually trained to either predict the noise that was added or the original data point x of 0, and it's usually trained on an MSE loss, maybe with some other terms, but yeah. Cool. And this is just a bunch of resources, a bunch of papers that were very foundational. They're very math heavy, so that is a big warning. But they are very good, very well developed. There's also some blogs over here if you'd like to learn a little bit more. These are also get into the math a little bit. But I think you should have a good foundation after today. So yeah, that's everything I have. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nick. That was really nice. Yeah, so maybe we'll look out for the poll, the slides, and the recordings, and we'll hope to see you in 2 weeks. And we're happy to stick around and chit chat or ask questions more if that works. Okay, see you all soon.